Welcome to TYT Interviews. Today I'll be speaking with Tim Canova, who's running for Florida's 23rd Congressional District against opponent Debbie Wasserman Schultz. How you doing today, Tim?
Fine. Thank you, Wesley. Nice to be with you.
And we had a couple seconds to chat before. Let's start out a little bit. Who are you? What's your background? And why are you running to unseat Debbie Wasserman Schultz?
I am a law professor at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. It's the only law school in this congressional district. I've been a law professor for the past 20 years. Prior to that, I had been practicing law for a while. I was a legislative aide to the late U.S. Senator Paul Tsongas from Massachusetts, a Democrat from Massachusetts. And why am I running? Last year, I got involved with the Citizens Trade Campaign, lobbying the entire Florida congressional delegation against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the only Democrat in the House delegation to vote to fast-track the agreement. And we were sorely disappointed with her. She was not very responsive to our group and engaging in any kind of a discussion, not her or not even her staff in any meaningful way. And it turns out that Wasserman Schultz had taken over $330,000 from corporate groups that supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership in just the last election cycle, and she's taken even more in this election cycle. And as I looked further, it was apparent that this was not an aberration. This is a pattern with Wasserman Schultz. She's been taking millions of dollars from the largest corporations and Wall Street banks, and she's been pushing their interests on issue after issue over the interests of ordinary folks. So she became the great protector of the payday loan industry. She's been against medical marijuana and taking money from private prisons, issue after issue. So, I was concerned, and an awful lot of us were, and that was the basis of this challenge. This is a grassroots movement. A lot of labor folks and a lot of progressive Democrats here in South Florida have been longing for this for a long time.
So it's interesting because those two issues bring up so much that's what's wrong with the country. I mean, you've got the influence of money in politics as well as trade regimes which are actually impoverishing the average American worker and eliminating jobs in the United States.
Absolutely. And I've taught international trade law for a lot of years and was very critical of the North American Free Trade Agreement and some of the other big liberalization projects like the World Trade Organization and the Bush administration's proposed free trade of the Americas. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another bad deal for Americans. It would outsource millions of American jobs. It would raise prescription drug prices because it was negotiated by the largest companies in the country, in the world, including the biggest pharmaceutical companies. And it would also raise costs to taxpayers. Big investors would be able to sue the U.S. government for the costs of complying with environmental and health and safety regulations. And in fact, that's exactly what TransCanada did under the North American Free Trade Agreement, under the NAFTA investor protection provisions. They announced they were going to sue the U.S. government for $15 billion for the damages they say that they're suffering as a result of President Obama canceling or not moving forward with the Keystone XL pipeline because of climate change reasons.
And where is that lawsuit right now?
I don't know. I recall a few months ago that TransCanada made a very public announcement, and they said that they were planning on suing and that they were going to be seeking $15 billion in damages. If the suit has already been filed, it would be in a federal court. But I really haven't been following it that closely for the last few weeks, really last several months, because I've been so busy with this campaign.
Yeah, I'm sure it's overwhelming. Is this your first run for office?
It is. I mentioned that I have worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked as a volunteer for candidates in the past. I've worked as a policy advisor, both for candidates and elected officials. I've spearheaded a grassroots campaign some years ago that helped New Mexico overturn its felony disenfranchisement law. So I'm not a newcomer to politics, but it is the first time that I'm actually the candidate.
Has there been anything that surprised you running as a Democratic candidate that you didn't really expect, or that you might have had an emotional notion of what something would be like, and then you saw the reality and were like, wow, not what I expected?
You know, what hits you as a candidate is how tiring and all-consuming it is quite often, and how you can't please everybody. Everybody has an opinion, even people who wish you well. You get a lot of advice from a lot of sources, and ultimately, I think for myself, a lot of it is just based on my own intuition, and you take the advice for what it's worth. But I get some crazy advice sometimes. I had somebody telling me I had to do something about my hair.
Like what?
Like what? Exactly.
A hat, a special wig, a mohawk?
Exactly.
God, that's too fun. No, people, I just remember when my father was running, people always had crazy ideas for him to push out there. And the thing is, when you're looking at your issues, what are the kind of issues that you're pushing for that you're having the most problems with different sectors of your voting public for? For instance, environmentalists versus people who are really concerned about Israel.
The issues have really been breaking my way the whole time. And I mean, this is what's incredible about this race. Wasserman Schultz has been bathing in corporate money for so long that whatever the issue is, whether it's medical marijuana or payday lending or Israel, nobody really knows where she's going to come out on any issue. There always seems to be a price that's going to be paid, and it ends up it's the constituents that end up paying the price, all for Wasserman Schultz's career advancement. And I think that's a perception that's grown quite a lot here in this district over the last few years. I look at the issues. I'm not tied to any donors. I'm raising money in thousands upon thousands of small contributions. So I'm not taking any money from any corporate political action committees, and none of those kinds of special interests. And it allows me the freedom to decide on the issues based on what's good for all of us, what's good for the constituents in this district, and my own principles. So I love the issues that we have, the economy and trade and opportunity for young folks. I mean, not just as a phrase, but in reality, what is it going to take for this generation to get the kinds of opportunities that my generation and my parents' generation had in the past? We really need a new deal, and we shouldn't be running away from that. We're long overdue for a new deal. We need to rebuild the country, infrastructure programs, jobs programs. We need to be directing resources to Main Street and not Wall Street. The system has become upside down. The 2008 financial collapse just did not change that, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it almost led to a retrenchment of those same interests to double down on what they wanted.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, let's go over some of the hierarchy of the issues that you're pushing for. Gun control.
Well, I'm in favor of stricter gun control. The tragic circumstances of what happened in Orlando, it really just shocks all of us. It's been very distracting, not just for me, but lots of folks on the campaign trail to have to. And it happened right here in the state. In fact, I was in Orlando when it happened. I was there for an AFL-CIO endorsement conference. This is like a nightmare that just doesn't end in this country. And I don't see why we have assault weapons on the streets of this country. These are military weapons. We wouldn't allow folks to drive a tank down the street and say, well, you have a right to the tank because you have a license to drive an automobile. A tank is not an automobile. An assault rifle is really not a firearm. It's not a gun. I can understand the interests of everyone to have their own personal protection. We have a Second Amendment. There should be a right to bear arms. There should be a right to protect your home and your family and your person. But an assault rifle is really a killing machine. And, it's shocking that the NRA and the gun lobby has been so strong. I got to say this hasn't been one of the premier issues in the campaign, but suddenly because of circumstances, it is on people's minds, rightly so.
So you're of agreement that it's time the federal government actually does something to protect Americans?
This is a national security, a domestic security issue. Folks can talk about that they're real tough for security, but we don't become more secure if everybody's got to run out and get an assault rifle. There are just too many soft targets in this country now. And what happened tragically in Orlando could have happened anywhere. It's true it was targeted at the gay and lesbian community, and that makes it that much more horrifying for those folks. to live under that kind of a threat. But it was an attack on all of us. It really was, and it could happen anytime, any place.
Absolutely. Now, I first learned about you through the Climate Mobilization Group and grassroots effort because you've taken the climate pledge that this is a World War II style event when it comes to the existential, survival of the United States and how we address it. Could you talk a little bit about the environment and what you're going to push for in Congress to make it happen?
I am for converting our economy and quickly to an alternative energy, fuel efficient, sustainable energy economy. I think we're overdue for it. I am in the Sunshine State, and we have not come anywhere near tapping the solar resources that Florida has at its disposal. Instead, you actually have folks in Tallahassee in the state government who are trying to extend fracking around the state, fracking even in the Everglades. Fracking would be a disaster for Florida, for its local economy, I should say for its groundwater safety, and it is just another way of putting carbon back into the atmosphere. We've got rising sea levels here in South Florida. That is not some hypothetical threat. All the studies are showing that over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years, major parts of Miami and South Florida could be underwater. We are talking about a threat to our very existence, to our homes, to our businesses. Now, that's going to require a multi-pronged approach. And I think as a country, the United States has got to commit itself to getting off of this carbon addiction and onto a solar and wind type of an economy. We shouldn't be lagging behind China and Germany in a solar economy. We should be leading the world. It should be providing new jobs on a massive scale to folks. At the same time, we need to come up with billions of dollars here in Florida and trillions of dollars nationwide for the infrastructure investments that will mitigate the effects and adapt to climate change and rising sea levels. That means investments, public infrastructure investments in raising roads, in building new bridges, new waterworks, new sewage treatment facilities. These are all placed in danger because of the rising sea levels and the kind of changes that are now beginning to occur even in the Florida aquifer as salt water starts penetrating further inland. So where's that money going to come from? How are we as a society, as a state, as a nation going to come up with the billions and trillions of dollars we need? And, this is where my experience as a law professor, I've been studying the financial markets and public finance in a historical perspective for many years. And I'll tell you, we're the only advanced country that doesn't have a federal infrastructure bank. And my dad's generation, the greatest generation, the New Deal, Great Depression, World War II generation, they had a big public infrastructure bank. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. There are ways to do this that have been tried before. They're used effectively overseas, and we don't do it here. And again, it's because Wall Street and the bond markets have such control over government policy. They don't want an infrastructure bank. They'd rather state and local governments come borrowing in the bond markets and paying interest rates to investors when that's not the way to build infrastructure, to finance it. It's not.
It's almost criminal when you think about what the outcomes of this will be. I mean, I'm sure you realize the federal government actually is doing absolutely no planning at all on how to deal with the effects of climate change. I mean, there's nothing on the books. There's no seawall to protect Florida. There's no seawall to protect New York. And these are projects that are going to take 20 or 30 years to build once we decide to build them.
That's right. And, this is the cost of living in a time when we've all been following this mantra that there's nothing the government is capable of doing, that we've got to privatize everything, that only the private sector can solve these problems. It's just not the case. This country in the past has solved huge problems, and it's done it when the government is independent of those private interests, when the government is not corrupt the way the politics are today, but it is acting in the interests of the American people. And it's happened before. It's got to happen again. You need the federal government to lead the way in solving these problems. I look at my dad's generation again to win World War II in 3.5 years on several continents and several oceans. And then after the war, to rebuild a war-torn world through the Marshall Plan, to reconstruct this country through the GI Bill of Rights, to build an infrastructure with the highway system and the space program. You know, the federal government did an awful lot of good in this world. And as it's retreated and given up power to large cartel-like businesses, it has only enriched the very top. You know, I was going to say the 1%, but it's even a small percentage of the 1%. And everyone else, you know, has taken it on the chin for way too long.
Absolutely agreed. Let's talk about a couple other issues here, which also tie together with everything else. Drugs. What do we think about the war on drugs?
The war on drugs has been a failure. You know, we lock up a couple of million people right now. That's the most in relative terms and in absolute terms in the world. You know, this is supposed to be the land of the free. We're supposed to value liberty. And liberty means giving adults the power to make their own mistakes, to free choice in a lot of regards. And to be locking folks up for using the same drugs that, from what we gather, the last 3 American presidents and a majority of the American people, according to most surveys, have used. This is just wrong. And of course, the populations that are usually paying the price and actually serving time in jails and prisons are usually, you know, African American, Hispanic, Native American, younger people who, you know, their lives are being disrupted for the rest of their lives. They get criminal records that follow them around. They're disenfranchised. They don't have the right to vote for the rest of their lives in many states. You know, they have more trouble making their way in the world, jobs and housing and all the rest. This is just not what we should be doing. You know, there's a reason, or probably many reasons, that this generation has been turning to drugs for so long. You know, there is folks are, this country is suffering, I think, from a mass type of a depression. People are trying to medicate themselves. And, you know, this is a public health problem. It is not a criminal justice problem. It should not be. Unfortunately, there are a lot of special interests that have vested interests in this drug war. And this is another issue between myself and Wasserman Schultz. She's been taking a lot of money over the years from the private prison companies, and she has been supporting private detention centers and private prisons. And when you do that, there is, again, a vested interest. There are companies that have contracts and they want to have the beds filled, you can say, in these detention centers. And the drug wars allow them to have, you know, healthy profits year after year. There should not be any profit incentive in this drug war. The drug war's got to come to an end. This generation doesn't need more prisons. It really needs hard labor. It needs folks to be challenged. It needs work opportunities and educational opportunities. There needs to be, this generation needs to find more meaning in work. And unfortunately, the job market has not been very, very kind to this generation.
No, it's been awful for this generation. It's also what I think is part of the depression is, look, as Americans, a lot of us, like it or not, we identify a lot of times with our work.
Yes.
And if somebody doesn't have fulfilling work or they're not part of a team, we live in this atomized society where the benefits go to very few people and everybody else just has to suck it.
That's right. And, you know, this job market is so lousy. The official unemployment rate now says it's less than 5%. And it's a joke. The last month, the unemployment rate actually fell. Why? Because more Americans stopped looking for work. The actual number of new jobs created last month was only 35,000. You need to be creating at least 150 to 200,000 jobs a month to keep up with the growth in population. You know, the job growth has been anemic for years. The labor participation rate has plummeted. The official unemployment rate is just a fantasy. When you look at what the economists call the U6 unemployment rate, that includes discouraged workers, people who have stopped looking for work because they can't find work, people who are working part-time, sometimes 2 or 3 part-time jobs. They want full-time work and they can't find it. You end up getting an unemployment rate, a U6 rate that's, at least in my district, between 11 and 12%. You know, that's more than 1 out of 10 individuals. I see a lot of college students and graduates, I should say, who graduate deeply in debt. They're paying high interest rates on their loans. And the job market's so lousy that they're living at home with their parents well into their 20s and into their 30s quite often. This is not a healthy economy. My opponent is oblivious to that. Instead, she goes crowing about the talking points that somehow we have a full employment economy. I don't know what reality she's living in, but it's not what I see every day here on the street.
No, she's living in a PR reality.
Yeah.
Where she's not having contact with people. I mean, I've worked a lot of jobs in the last 20 years to include being a temp. And the opportunities are not out there the way they were 20 and 30 years ago. And we haven't even begun the real wave of automation that's going to come and strip even more jobs from people in the next 4 or 5 years.
Absolutely. And, this is happening while Wall Street has essentially been subsidized. I studied the central banking system. Since the financial collapse, in just the first 2 or 3 years after the financial collapse of 2008, the Federal Reserve made over $29 trillion in low-interest loans to the biggest Wall Street banks and hedge funds and foreign banks and foreign central banks.
Wait, $29 trillion
in near zero interest rate loans. And at the same time, it had its quantitative easing programs, QE1, QE2, QE3, in which it purchased another $3 trillion of assets, treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities from these same big banks and hedge funds. So, not surprisingly, the stock market comes roaring back. Real estate prices in downtown Manhattan, Miami, San Francisco reach new heights, out of reach for even upper middle class folks. And what is done for Main Street? The Federal Reserve gave zero. And you compare it with what the Federal Reserve did in the 1930s and 1940s when Roosevelt was president, during the Depression and into World War II. And those 12 regional Federal Reserve banks were making hundreds of millions of dollars in loans directly to small businesses. It had a Main Street strategy. We don't have a Federal Reserve that looks out for Main Street at all anymore. And we don't have politicians. We don't have a Congress and a Senate and an administration that's been looking out enough for Main Street interests either.
We really don't. And a lot of it comes back to the banking system. I mean, I've got a lot of friends, and I'm sure you know a lot of people in banking, and what they tell me is, hey, man, it takes as much work for me to do a $100 million deal as it does a $1 million deal. So I don't do $1 million deals.
Right. Well, and that's not surprising. This is what big banks do. They're going to be channeling credit to big borrowers, and that's why mergers and acquisitions get bigger and bigger. We used to have a Justice Department and a Federal Trade Commission, which would try to put some lid on those mergers and acquisitions so it wouldn't be encouraging monopoly and gouging of consumers and workers. But, again, what you need to build in addition to a private banking system is a parallel public institutions. I mentioned the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So that would be a federal infrastructure bank. That's a public institution. The Federal Reserve should be acting more like a public institution. And then down at the more granular level, when you talk about payday lending, Wasserman Schultz has been protecting these payday lenders. They charge 300% and more here in Florida. They trap lower income folks in a cycle of debt. And she says, she has been saying for a long time now, that it's good for the poor because they have no other alternatives but loan sharks. And I say, again, she is missing real progressive alternatives that this country has used in the past. Our postal system used to have millions of customers. They used to have a bank account system, a checking account system from 1911 all the way through 1967. So virtually from Theodore Roosevelt to John Kennedy, the postal system provided millions of working folks with banking facilities. And when they privatized that, got rid of that, where did it leave the poor? Now, somebody with a low income who cannot afford a checking account very well might have to go to a check cashing place. This is that happens all the time. This is their lives. They go to a check cashing place and they pay 10% of their check over to the company just for the privilege of cashing a check. So again, parallel public banking facilities like a postal banking system or state chartered banks like the Bank of North Dakota. These are not novel solutions, but it's just that Wall Street and their political cloud and their lobbyists get in the way of these progressive solutions.
Yeah, they've proven these things work in practice the same way with having a good education system, and somehow we act like it's impossible to figure out how to run an education system.
Exactly. Or health insurance, with not even a public option for everybody. We have regressed in many ways. And I think it really started in many ways during the Reagan administration. You had this move to deregulate and privatize and get rid of antitrust enforcement and just that whole ideology that there's no government like no government. And that leaves us as a country without the powers, without the capability to solve our problems. And that's what people find frustrating. Instead, you get politicians, they promise the world, they take so much money from big corporate interests, they just kick the can down the road, they don't solve people's problems, and then we're surprised why so many folks want anti-establishment candidates like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and why folks have just had it with the same insiders like Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Now, how are we going to beat these insiders? How many volunteers do you have working for you? How many do you need? When is the primary?
Okay, the primary is August 30th, which sounds like it's a way in the future.
Oh, no, that's really soon.
It's real soon.
That's 2
Folks
months.
have to be registered by August 1st. Democrat, it's a closed primary, so independents out there, and even Republicans, there are a lot of Republicans changing their party affiliation to Democrat. I know that for a fact, so that they can vote for a change in this district. This is a safely Democratic district. If you don't have a real primary challenge, if you don't hold the incumbent accountable in the primary, you don't have much of a democracy. And folks have to be registered by August 1st. Absentee ballots go out in the mail in 4 weeks, the middle of July. And there are a lot of folks who vote absentee here in Florida. So we're down to 4 to 6 weeks. This is the home stretch of this campaign. We've got several field offices. We've been building up a ground game. We've got a lot of volunteers, but there's a lot of help that we need. And there have been folks who have been going to timcanova.com. They go to my website. They can look at the issues that we're running on. Many of them already know the issues that we're running on. And you could go to that website. You could be phone banking for us. We've got phone bankers from really all over the state of Florida and all over the country. And this is helping even the playing field. What Wasserman Schultz has had going for her is simply the name recognition. She's been around for a dozen years. I haven't been around in politics running for office for all that long. I'll tell you, in the first quarter of this year, in those first 3 months, we raised more individual donations in the state of Florida than Wasserman Schultz did. She had a 12-year head start. So, folks are coming to our cause. We need all the help we can get right now in the next 4 weeks.
And it's timcanova.com?
Yes, Wesley.
Okay, timcanova.com. TYT listeners, if we're going to build a progressive movement, if we're actually going to have progress and push the world forward, we have to get people into Congress, into the Senate, into state Senate, into state houses nationwide. Here's your chance. Don't be a lonely progressive. Jump on Tim's team, volunteer, phone bank, knock on doors, make it happen, people. It's up to us.
If I could just add a couple of things that I've challenged Wasserman Schultz to debates. She's been dodging it. A lot of folks have been asking her around the country and around the state. And, we got to keep the pressure on her. She certainly didn't schedule a lot of debates at the presidential level. And she doesn't want to have to defend her record here at all. So we're pressing her on that. And
so for the next 2 months, if you're a TYT listener and you pass Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you should yell out, "Why aren't you debating Tim Canova?" Or something to that effect.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. And I'll say this also. If we can beat Debbie Wasserman Schultz here on August 30th, there's not an incumbent in the country who's safe. That's what it shows. When you could take down the head of the Democratic National Committee in a primary, it means in 2 years from now, we could have a brand new Congress. If we have enough folks stepping up and challenging incumbents in the primary, all these energy that has gone to non-establishment candidates this year, if that money and energy goes to helping fund insurgent candidates in 2 years, we'll have a brand new Congress.
That would be music to my ears. Well, tell you what, Tim, if you need to, and come on, and we can do another interview in August. But most importantly, I want you to come on when you win this primary.
You got my word on that, Wesley. Thank you.
Okay, good luck, Tim. Nice having you.
Get it.